The mist clung to the hollows of eastern Kentucky like a shroud, wrapping the twisted oaks and forgotten dirt roads in a perpetual gray haze. In the shadow of those ancient Appalachian ridges lay Whitaker Hollow, a place where time seemed to curdle and sour, where the wind carried echoes of whispers that no one dared repeat aloud. It was here, in this forsaken corner of the world, that the Whitaker clan had rooted themselves for over a century, their bloodlines weaving tighter and tighter like the vines choking the life from abandoned barns. Outsiders seldom ventured this far. Those who did spoke in hushed tones of the womened pale, ethereal figures with eyes that held secrets deeper than the coal mines scarring the earth below. Elara Whitaker was one such woman, the eldest daughter of a line that twisted back on itself in ways that defied nature's warnings. Her skin was the color of moonlit snow, stretched thin over bones that seemed too fragile for the burdens they carried. She moved through the dense underbrush with a grace born of necessity, her bare feet silent on the leaf-strewn path leading to the family homestead, a cluster of weathered shacks huddled together as if for protection against the encroaching wilderness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweeter, more cloying, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. Elara's mind wandered to the stories her grandmother had murmured in the dead of night, tales of unions forged in desperation, of children born with marks that spoke of sins unspoken. But tonight, something stirred in the hollow that hadn't been felt in generations, the faint rumble of an engine, slicing through the silence like a knife. A stranger's truck, its headlights piercing the fog, crept up the overgrown trail. The man behind the wheel, Harlan Crow, a reporter chasing whispers of the lost tribes of Kentucky, gripped the steering wheel tighter as the first glimpses of the compound emerged. He had heard the rumors in dingy bars and roadside diners, families so intertwined that their features blurred into one another, women who bore the weight of a darkness that festered in the blood. Little did he know that stepping into Whitaker Hollow would unravel threads not just of history, but of sanity itself, drawing him into a web where love and horror entwined like lovers in a forbidden embrace. As Elara watched from the shadows, her heart quickened with a mix of fear and forbidden curiosity, the first crack in the facade of isolation that had held her world intact for so long. Deep in the folds of the eastern Kentucky Appalachians, where the ridges rise like ancient spines and the valleys, known locally as hollows, carve narrow, shadowed paths inaccessible to all but the most determined, lies a place forgotten by maps and time. Whitaker Hollow, though the name shifts in whispered tales from one forgotten crease to another, represents those secluded pockets where families have dwelled undisturbed for generations, their lives bound to the land in ways that both sustained and ensnared them. The terrain itself enforces isolation: steep, forested slopes choked with rhododendron and laurel, dirt tracks that turn to mud slicks after rain, and creeks that swell without warning, cutting off the outside world for days or weeks. Roads, when they exist, are little more than ruts worn by generations of feet and the occasional mule, leading nowhere but deeper into the clan's domain. This compound emerges gradually to the rare intruder, a scattering of weathered cabins, trailers patched with tin, and outbuildings sagging under the weight of years, all clustered at the hollow's end as if huddling against the encroaching wilderness. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys fueled by coal scavenged from abandoned seams, and the air carries the perpetual damp of earth and decay. No power lines stretch here, no cell signals pierce the canopy. The family has rooted itself so thoroughly that the outside world feels like a distant rumor, passed down in cautionary fragments by elders who remember the last stranger who wandered too close. For over a century, the bloodlines have intertwined without interruption, marriages arranged within the tight circle of kin to keep land and legacy intact, or perhaps out of sheer necessity in a place where outsiders are viewed with suspicion bordering on threat. Children are born, raised, and paired off among cousins, siblings in all but name, reinforcing a cycle that began in desperation during harder times, when coal camps closed, when floods wiped out crops, when poverty made venturing out seem riskier than staying put. The compound becomes a self-contained realm, its inhabitants pale from lives spent in shadow, their features echoing one another in subtle, unsettling ways. High cheekbones sharpened by hardship, eyes set a fraction too wide or close, movements deliberate and guarded. Guard dogs prowl the perimeters, barking at the scent of intrusion, while the women, central to the daily rhythm of survival, tend gardens of beans and potatoes in thin soil, haul water from springs, and preserve what little the land yields. Their world is one of routine etched by isolation, where stories of the broader world filter in only through battered radios or rare trips to distant towns for supplies, always hurried and wary. Yet beneath the surface quiet lies a tension, a knowledge unspoken that this seclusion has exacted a toll, manifesting in frailties passed down like heirlooms, binding them ever tighter to the hollow that both protects and imprisons. As Harlan Crow's truck rattled deeper into Whitaker Hollow, the fog parted just enough to reveal the first fleeting glimpses of the women who called this forsaken place home. They moved like ghosts along the edges of the compound, their figures emerging from behind sagging porches or from the shadowed doorways of tin-roofed shacks, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of an engine. Harlan slowed, his breath catching as he took in their appearances, features that seemed both familiar and profoundly wrong, as if nature had repeated a flawed pattern too many times. The women shared an uncanny resemblance, their faces echoing one another in ways that went beyond mere family likeness. High, sharp cheekbones that jutted prominently beneath skin pale from years spent under dense canopy and perpetual shade, eyes set slightly askew, some drifting independently in a way that made direct gaze impossible, jaws narrowed or asymmetrical, teeth sparse and misaligned from generations without dental care or genetic diversity. Their builds were often slight and fragile, limbs thin and movements hesitant, marked by subtle deformities, a curved spine here, fingers fused or shortened there, that spoke of recessive traits amplified through repeated close-kin unions. Ilara stood out among them, though not for lacking these traits. Her eyes, wide and slightly misaligned, held a haunting clarity amid the haze, and her skin carried the same translucent pallor that made veins visible beneath like faint blue rivers. She watched the truck with a stillness that bordered on predatory, her head tilted in curiosity rather than fear. The other women clustered nearby, some communicating in low murmurs or guttural sounds rather than clear words, their behaviors guarded and instinctive, shaped by a lifetime of isolation where strangers were threats and speech itself could be a struggle for those most affected. Harlan felt a chill unrelated to the damp air as he observed them tending to daily chores, hauling water, feeding scraggly chickens, with deliberate, labored motions that hinted at underlying frailties, reduced stature, occasional tremors, or expressions vacant from cognitive burdens passed down like cursed heirlooms. These were not mere quirks of hardship but the visible toll of bloodlines folded inward for too long, manifesting in facial asymmetries, developmental delays, and an ethereal fragility that made them seem apart from the world beyond the ridges. The women's behaviors reinforced the unease, wary glances, sudden withdrawals into the shadows, or barks and grunts from those unable to form sentences, a primal language born of necessity in a clan where full expression had eroded over decades. In their presence, Harlan sensed the first true weight of the Hollow's secrets, the abnormality not just in appearance but in the quiet, pervasive otherness that isolation and repetition had wrought upon their very humanity. In the shadowed heart of Whitaker Hollow, the family's existence revolved around an ironclad code dictated by the patriarch, a grizzled elder named Josiah Whitaker, whose word carried the weight of scripture and shotgun combined. Tall and gaunt, with eyes like chipped flint and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder over the ridges, Josiah ruled from the largest of the shacks, his presence looming over every decision, every union, every breath taken within the compound's boundaries. He spoke often of blood purity, of keeping the Whitaker name untainted by the corruption of the outside world, a world he painted as full of deceitful strangers who would steal their land and dilute their strength. Marriages were not matters of the heart but of preservation, arranged from cradle days to ensure that no drop of outsider blood seeped into the lineage. Josiah's rules were absolute: daughters and sons paired only with cousins or closer kin, unions blessed in hasty ceremonies under the oaks, witnessed by the clan alone. This endogamy, he claimed, honored the ancestors who had carved the hollow from wilderness, binding them closer to the soil that fed them and the secrets it held. Women bore the brunt of enforcement, watched closely, their movements restricted beyond the garden plots and creek banks, their bodies vessels for continuing the pure line. Defiance meant exile or worse, whispers of girls who vanished into the woods for daring to glance toward passing travelers. The patriarch's sons enforced his edicts with fists and threats, perpetuating the cycle that kept the family insular, their features growing ever more alike, their frailties compounding like debts unpaid. This patriarchal grip stemmed from generations past, when Cole's collapse and floods isolated the hollow further, making outsiders rare and trust rarer still. Land passed only through blood ties, poverty chained them to the earth, and Josiah's forebears had decreed that marrying within fortified their claim against government men or rival clans. He preached it from his rocking chair on the porch, Bible in one hand, rifle in the other, insisting that dilution brought weakness, that the deformities creeping into newborns were tests of faith rather than consequences of repetition. Women like Alara learned early to bow heads and accept betrothals, their roles reduced to bearers of the next generation, their voices silenced in family councils where only men spoke. Yet in quiet moments, away from Josiah's gaze, doubts festered, glimpses of magazines smuggled from town hinting at wider worlds, where choices weren't chained to blood. The rules preserved the clan but at a cost etched into every asymmetrical face and faltering step, a rigid hierarchy that brooked no deviation, binding them in a web of obligation disguised as protection. Harlan would soon learn just how fiercely Josiah guarded this domain, his authority the unseen force that shaped every life in the Hollow, turning kinship into both shield and cage. In the days following Harlan Crow's arrival in Whitaker Hollow, an unexpected current stirred beneath the clan's rigid surface, one that threatened to erode the foundations of their carefully guarded isolation. Alara, at 23 the youngest of the women old enough to be promised, had always felt the pull of something beyond the ridges, a restlessness that set her apart from her sisters, whose acceptance of their fates came as naturally as breathing the damp mountain air. Her betrothal to her cousin Enoch was spoken of as inevitable, a union that would bind another thread in the family's intricate knot, yet Alara's stolen glances toward the outsider betrayed a hunger for the forbidden. Their first true encounter happened by chance at the spring-fed creek where Alara drew water each dawn, her pail balanced on a hip scarred faintly from childhood falls. Harlan, exploring the Hollow's edges under the pretense of photographing abandoned mines, stumbled upon her there amid the mist-shrouded ferns. She froze at the sight of him, her mismatched eyes widening not just in fear but in wonder at this man who carried the scent of the wider world. Diesel and city soap mingled with the clean sharpness of freedom. He spoke softly, asking only for directions at first, but his voice lacked the harsh cadence of the Hollow's men, carrying instead a gentleness that coaxed words from her lips she had never dared utter aloud. What began as fleeting meetings, moments snatched while she gathered herbs or mended fences away from watchful eyes, blossomed into something deeper, more dangerous. Harlan found himself drawn to her fragile beauty, the way her pale skin flushed under his gaze, her tentative smiles revealing teeth uneven yet endearing in their honesty. Alara, in turn, listened rapt as he described cities with lights that rivaled stars, roads that led to oceans she had only dreamed of in fevered sleep. Their hands brushed once, then lingered, fingers intertwining in the shadows of overhanging laurel, a touch that ignited sparks neither could ignore. Kisses followed in hidden clearings, urgent and whispered, her body pressing against his with a desperation born of years suppressed. This forbidden romance challenged the very secrecy that defined the Whitaker clan, forcing Alara to question the purity Josiah preached, to see the Hollow not as sanctuary but prison. Harlan, too, felt the pull intensify, his initial curiosity about the family's anomalies giving way to a protective fierce desire to whisk her away from the deformities and controls that marked her world. Yet every stolen embrace carried risk, the rustle of leaves might be a brother's footfall, a distant dog bark a warning that eyes were always watching. In those moments of closeness, amid the scent of moss and impending rain, love bloomed like a rare flower in poisoned soil, fragile and defiant, threatening to expose cracks in the family's armored facade that no amount of patriarchal decree could seal. As Harlan's bond with Alara deepened, she led him one moonless night to the oldest shack in the compound, a crumbling structure avoided by the clan, its attic sealed by Josiah's decree years ago. With trembling hands, she pried loose a boarded window, guiding him up a rickety ladder into the suffocating darkness above. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of his flashlight, revealing stacks of yellowed papers, cracked leather-bound ledgers, and a massive family Bible swollen with inserted pages, all hidden beneath tarps and forgotten trunks. This was the clan's forbidden archive, records meticulously kept by long-dead matriarchs who documented births, deaths, and unions in faded ink, a chronicle that Josiah claimed was sacred but kept locked away from prying eyes. Harlan's heart pounded as he opened the Bible first, its genealogy pages tracing the Whitaker line back to the 1880s, names repeating in incestuous patterns, brothers wedding sisters, uncles taking nieces, cousins pairing off in endless loops to retain the Hollow's land. Marginal notes detailed the consequences. infants born with clubbed feet, extra fingers, or hearts too weak to survive the first winter, children marked by hydrocephaly, their heads enlarged and fragile, others with eyes that failed to track or minds that wandered in perpetual fog. Ledgers revealed more clinical horrors, entries on seizures that racked young bodies, deafness passed down like a family trait, and mental instabilities that turned kin against kin in fits of rage or silence. Faded photographs tucked between pages showed generations of Whitakers posed stiffly on porches, their features devolving over time, jaws protruding or receding unnaturally, limbs shortened, expressions vacant or asymmetrical, echoes of recessive genes amplified through relentless inbreeding. One tintype captured a woman with a neck swollen by goiter, another a child with fused limbs, captioned in spidery script as blessed by the blood. Medical scraps, perhaps from rare visits by traveling doctors decades past, noted diagnoses of rare syndromes, warnings ignored in favor of purity. Ilara watched Harlan's face pale in the dim light, her own eyes reflecting the weight of truths she had glimpsed as a child before Josiah sealed the attic. These records laid bare the human cost of isolation, generations diminished physically and mentally, deformities not as divine tests but as inevitable outcomes of blood too closely shared. The air grew heavier with the scent of mildew and regret, each page turned exposing the clan's dark inheritance, a legacy of suffering etched in ink, an image that no amount of patriarchal denial could erase. Harlan realized then that the Hollow's secrets ran deeper than rumor, rooted in a tangible history of genetic ruin that bound the family in chains far stronger than any ridge or rule. The fragile secrecy of Whitaker Hollow shattered on a rain-slicked evening when Josiah Whitaker, fueled by whispers from a watchful grandson, burst into the old shack where Harlan and Ilara lingered too long after another clandestine meeting. The patriarch's heavy boots thudded against the creaking floorboards, his silhouette filling the doorway like a storm cloud, shotgun cradled in gnarled hands that had felled deer and dispatched threats alike. His eyes, narrowed beneath bushy brows etched with decades of suspicion, locked onto Harlan with a fury that twisted his weathered face into something primal, lips curling back over yellowed teeth in a snarl that echoed the guard dog's distant howls. "You," Josiah growled, voice gravelly from years of pipe smoke and unspoken rages, leveling the barrel toward the outsider who had dared trespass not just land but blood. Harlan froze, hands raised instinctively, the air thick with the metallic tang of impending violence and the damp rot of the hollow seeping through cracks in the walls. Ilara gasped, stepping between them with a courage born of desperation, her slight frame trembling yet defiant, pleading in fractured whispers for her grandfather to lower the weapon. But Josiah's rage was a force unto itself, rooted in the terror of exposure, the fear that this city man with his questions and camera would drag their insulated world into the light, unraveling the purity he had guarded with iron fists. Shoving Ilara aside with a rough hand that left bruises blooming on her pale arm, Josiah advanced, the shotgun's muzzle inches from Harlan's chest, spitting accusations of corruption and theft. The confrontation erupted in a blur of shouts and scuffles. Harlan lunged not for escape but to protect Ilara, grappling with the old man whose strength belied his age, wiry muscles honed from a lifetime wresting survival from unforgiving soil. Fists connected with bone-jarring force, blood spilling from split lips as the two men tumbled amid scattered tools and overturned crates, the shotgun clattering to the floor in the chaos. Women and kin gathered at the commotion, their pale faces peering through the misted windows, murmurs rising like the wind through the ridges, some frozen in fear, others murmuring approval of Josiah's defense. The struggle left bruises and gashes, Harlan's camera shattered under a boot heel, evidence of his intrusion crushed as thoroughly as the patriarch sought to crush the threat. In that raw clash, the Hollow's veneer of quiet isolation cracked wide, violence bubbling up from the depths of generational paranoia, forcing all present to confront the fragility of the walls they had built against the world. In the wake of Josiah's violent outburst, Ilara's world fractured further, the bruises on her arm a stark reminder of the chains that bound her far beyond physical marks. No longer content to whisper dreams with Harlan in hidden clearings, she resolved to flee the hollow that had birthed and imprisoned her, a desperation fueled by years of unyielding control that seeped into every facet of clan life. From childhood, the women were taught submission as survival, meals portioned under Josiah's watchful eye, movements tracked by brothers and cousins who reported deviations, punishments swift for any hint of rebellion, whether a stolen glance at a passing truck or questions about the world beyond the ridges. Psychological dominion ran deeper than the shotgun's threat, It was woven into nightly prayers that glorified purity while ignoring the frailties it birthed, into stories that painted outsiders as devils who would drag them to hellish cities. Ilara had seen sisters broken by this, beaten not just with hands but with words that eroded will, confined to shacks for days without food, forced into unions that felt like slow suffocation. Communication itself was curtailed for those most affected by the bloodline's toll, their grunts and gestures mocked yet controlled, ensuring no unified dissent could form. Fear of exile loomed largest, tales of girls lost to the wilderness or worse, their names stricken from the family Bible as if they never existed. One storm-lashed night, as thunder masked the creek's roar, Ilara slipped from her bed, heart hammering against ribs that ached from old falls and newer grips. Barefoot to silence her steps, she darted into the dense thicket, branches whipping her pale skin, drawing blood that mingled with rain. Panic clawed at her as dogs stirred in the distance, their barks a chorus that could summon the men. She ran blindly uphill, through laurel hells that tangled like grasping fingers, her breath ragged, mind flashing to Harlan's promises of escape routes mapped in secret. The psychological weight bore down even in flight, the ingrained terror that freedom was sin, that the hollow's pull would drag her back, broken further. Revealing this extent in frantic confessions to Harlan later, hidden in a cave overlooking the valley, Ilara exposed the clan's true machinery of control. Isolation not just geographic but mental, a web of guilt, fear, and dependency that kept generations ensnared, their spirits as deformed as their bodies. Her attempt, though faltering when exhaustion forced her return before dawn, ignited a spark, proof that the cage could be rattled, that one woman's desperation might unravel the carefully knotted threads of domination. As Harlan's nights in Whitaker Hollow lengthened, the veil between the natural and the otherworldly thinned, revealing supernatural elements that had long haunted the clan, whispers attributing their bloodline's afflictions not merely to biology but to an ancient curse woven into the very soil of the hollow. On windless evenings, when fog pooled thick as milk in the valleys, faint murmurs drifted through the compound, voices not of the living, fragmented pleas and accusations echoing from the ridges, speaking names long buried in unmarked graves. Ilara confided in Harlan during one shadowed rendezvous that these were the restless spirits of ancestors, bound by a malediction uttered generations ago, when the first Whitakers defied taboo unions yet persisted, inviting wrath upon their progeny. The curse, passed down in hushed bedtime warnings, stemmed from a matriarch's pact or betrayal. Tales varied, but all agreed it condemned the bloodline to perpetual inward turning, deformities as marks of spectral vengeance, ensuring no escape from the hollow's grasp. Nights brought vivid manifestations, pale apparitions glimpsed at the tree line, figures with features mirroring the clan's own asymmetries, drifting silently as if searching for release. Children woke screaming from dreams of ghostly hands pressing upon their chests, foretelling frailties to come, while elders claimed visions of cursed forebears wandering the paths, their eyes hollow warnings against dilution or flight. Harlan, initially skeptical, felt the shift himself, unexplained chills in the warmest shacks, shadows elongating unnaturally in lantern light, and once, a whisper uttering his name from the darkness beyond the porch, cold breath grazing his neck though no one stood near. The women bore it with resigned terror, their pale faces turning toward the sounds with knowing dread, some crossing themselves furtively despite Josiah's disdain for weak superstitions. Yet the patriarch himself silenced discussions, perhaps fearing the truth that the hauntings intensified with each challenged rule, as if the spirits stirred to enforce the isolation that fed both curse and clan. These nocturnal disturbances blurred the line between genetic inevitability and supernatural retribution, the whispers growing insistent, carrying fragments of old Appalachian lore twisted to the Whitaker's fate, promises of madness for those who strayed, eternal entanglement for the blood. Ilara trembled recounting childhood nights when ethereal lights danced over graves, or disembodied cries mimicked newborns doomed from birth, binding the living in fear as tangible as Josiah's shotgun. The cracks deepened in Whitaker Hollow as Harlan's presence and Ilara's faltering escape ignited suspicions that spread like wildfire through dry underbrush, fracturing loyalties that had held the clan together through generations of hardship. Enoch, Ilara's intended, a broad-shouldered man with eyes too close-set and a temper quick as summer lightning, first sensed the shift, overhearing whispers among the women, catching Ilara's distant gazes toward the outsider's temporary lodging in an abandoned miner's cabin. Long-buried resentments surfaced, brothers who chafed under Josiah's unyielding rule, sisters weary of bearing children marked by the blood's toll, younger kin who glimpsed in Harlan a bridge to freedoms denied. Betrayal emerged from unexpected quarters when Myra, Ilara's closest sister, a quiet woman whose own deformities left her speech halting and her heart guarded, approached Josiah in the dim light of his porch one evening. Driven by jealousy over Ilara's stolen affections or perhaps a twisted loyalty to the patriarch's vision of purity, Myra confessed fragments, sightings of secret meetings, Ilara's tears over the attic records, murmurs of flight. Her words, stuttered yet damning, unleashed a storm. Josiah's rage turned inward, questioning sons who had failed to watch closely enough, daughters whose silence now seemed complicity. Accusations flew in heated gatherings around the central fire pit, voices rising over the crackle of burning hickory, faces illuminated in flickering orange that accentuated asymmetries and scars. Enoch confronted Ilara publicly, his hands gripping her arms with bruising force, demanding truths she could no longer deny, while others wavered, some defending the old ways with fervent nods, others averting eyes heavy with doubt. A cousin, long resentful of arranged pairings that ignored his affections for Myra, sided openly with Harlan's influence, whispering to kin of the record's horrors, sowing seeds that the patriarch's purity was poison. These fractures splintered the clan's unity, long-buried truths erupting in shouts and shoves, alliances shifting like the mist rolling off the ridges. Women who once moved in silent accord now exchanged loaded glances, men divided between blind obedience and the allure of change. The weight of generations pressed down, resentments over unequal burdens, favored sons versus overlooked daughters, the able-bodied mocking the frail, fueling a betrayal that threatened to shatter the hollow's fragile cohesion, exposing vulnerabilities Josiah had long suppressed with fear and force. Amid the escalating chaos of fractured loyalties and nocturnal hauntings, Harlan and Ilara, driven by a desperate need for answers, returned to the forbidden attic once more, prying deeper into sealed trunks that Josiah had sworn were empty relics. In the farthest corner, beneath layers of moth-eaten quilts and brittle newspapers yellowed by time, they uncovered a concealed door, its hinges rusted but yielding to Harlan's insistent shoulder. The narrow passage beyond led to a hidden chamber, a cramped room carved into the cabin's foundation, lit only by slivers of moonlight filtering through cracks in the log walls, the air stale and heavy with the scent of earth and unwashed flesh. There, chained to an iron ring bolted into the floor, sat the clan's most guarded secret, the queen of the inbred line, a woman named Lorelei, eldest sibling to Josiah himself, hidden away for decades after birthing children whose deformities defied survival, her existence a living embodiment of the bloodline's deepest shame and power. Her skin was parchment thin, stretched over a frame twisted by generations of repetition, limbs elongated yet frail, fingers webbed, a face bearing the exaggerated marks of the Whittaker features pushed to extremity, eyes bulging and mismatched, a jaw protruding in grotesque asymmetry, hair white and wild like Spanish moss draping her shoulders. She rocked gently, murmuring in a voice raspy from disuse, reciting lineages and curses that intertwined fact with the supernatural whispers plaguing the hollow. Lorelei was no mere prisoner but the matriarch preserved, the purest vessel of the line, her offspring secretly integrated into the clan to reinforce the blood, her madness a blend of isolation and genetic collapse. Josiah had concealed her to maintain control, fearing her prophecies of doom if the cycle broke, her presence the anchor that both sustained and doomed them. As her gaze fixed on Ilara with unnerving recognition, speaking of shared blood and inevitable return, the revelation struck like thunder, unraveling the fragile justifications of purity, exposing the hollow's core rot in human form. Harlan recoiled in horror, camera forgotten, while Ilara wept at the mirror of her possible fate, the queen's existence a climactic key that threatened to dissolve the clan's illusions, forcing confrontations that could shatter Whittaker Hollow forever.